万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world 尝试吧。
For as long as countries have kept secrets from one another, they have tried to steal them from one another. Espionage has been and will remain an integral part of statecraft, even as its techniques continually evolve. America's first spies spent the Revolutionary War using ciphers, clandestine courier networks, and invisible ink to correspond with each other and their foreign allies. In World War II, the emerging field of signals intelligence helped uncover Japanese war plans. During the early Cold War, the United States intelligence capabilities literally went into the stratosphere, with the advent of the U-2 and other high-altitude spy planes that could photograph Soviet military installations with impressive clarity. The simple stars etched on the memorial wall at the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, honor the 140 agency officers who gave their lives serving their country. The memorial offers an enduring reminder of countless acts of courage. Yet those instances of heroism and the CIA's many quiet successes remain far less well known to the American public than the mistakes that have sometimes marred the agency's history. The defining test for intelligence has always been to anticipate and help policymakers navigate profound shifts in the international landscape, the plastic moments that come along only a few times each century. As President Joe Biden has reiterated, the United States faces one of those rare moments today, as consequential as the dawn of the Cold War or the post-9/11 period. China's rise and Russia's revanchism pose daunting geopolitical challenges in a world of intense strategic competition in which the United States no longer enjoys uncontested primacy and in which existential climate threats are mounting. Complicating matters further is a revolution in technology even more sweeping than the Industrial Revolution or the beginning of the nuclear age. From microchips to artificial intelligence to quantum computing, emerging technologies are transforming the world, including the profession of intelligence. In many ways, these developments make the CIA's job harder than ever, giving adversaries powerful new tools to confuse us, evade us, and spy on us. And yet, as much as the world is changing, espionage remains an interplay between humans and technology. There will continue to be secrets that only humans can collect and clandestine operations that only humans can conduct. Technological advances, particularly in signals intelligence, have not made such human operations irrelevant, as some have predicted, but have instead revolutionized their practice. To be an effective 21st century intelligence service, the CIA must blend a mastery of emerging technologies with the people-to-people skills and individual daring that have always been at the heart of our profession. That means equipping operations officers with the tools and tradecraft to conduct espionage in a world of constant technological surveillance and equipping analysts with sophisticated artificial intelligence models that can digest mammoth amounts of open-source and clandestinely acquired information so that they can make their best human judgments. At the same time, what the CIA does with the intelligence it gathers is also changing. Strategic declassification, the intentional public disclosure of certain secrets to undercut rivals and rally allies, has become an even more powerful tool for policymakers. Using it doesn't mean recklessly jeopardizing the sources or methods used to collect the intelligence, but it does mean judiciously resisting the reflexive urge to keep everything classified. The U.S. intelligence community is also learning the increasing value of intelligence diplomacy, gaining a new understanding of how its efforts to bolster allies and counter foes can support policymakers. This is a time of historic challenges for the CIA and the entire intelligence profession, with geopolitical and technological shifts posing as big a test as we've ever faced. Success will depend on blending traditional human intelligence with emerging technologies in creative ways. It will require, in other words, adapting to a world where the only safe prediction about change is that it will accelerate. Title 1: Putin Unbound. The post-Cold War era came to a definitive end the moment Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. I have spent much of the past 2 decades trying to understand the combustible combination of grievance, ambition, and insecurity that Russian President Vladimir Putin embodies. One thing I have learned is that it is always a mistake to underestimate his fixation on controlling Ukraine and its choices. Without that control, he believes it is impossible for Russia to be a great power or for him to be a great Russian leader. That tragic and brutish fixation has already brought shame to Russia and exposed its weaknesses, from its one-dimensional economy to its inflated military prowess to its corrupt political system. Putin's invasion has also prompted breathtaking determination and resolve from the Ukrainian people. I have seen their courage firsthand on frequent wartime trips to Ukraine, punctuated by Russian air raids and vivid images of Ukrainian battlefield tenacity and ingenuity. Putin's war has already been a failure for Russia on many levels. His original goal of seizing Kiev and subjugating Ukraine proved foolish and illusory. His military has suffered immense damage. At least 315,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded, 2/3 of Russia's pre-war tank inventory has been destroyed, and Putin's vaunted decades-long military modernization program has been hollowed out. All this is a direct result of Ukrainian soldiers' valor and skill, backed up by Western support. Meanwhile, Russia's economy is suffering long-term setbacks, and the country is sealing its fate as China's economic vassal. Putin's overblown ambitions have backfired in another way, too. They have prompted NATO to grow larger and stronger. Although Putin's repressive grip does not seem likely to weaken anytime soon, his war in Ukraine is quietly corroding his power at home. The short-lived mutiny launched last June by the mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin offered a glimpse at some of the dysfunction lurking behind Putin's carefully polished image of control. For a leader who painstakingly crafted a reputation as the arbiter of order, Putin looked detached and indecisive as Prigozhin's ragtag mutineers made their way up the road to Moscow. For many in the Russian elite, the question was not so much whether the emperor had no clothes as why he was taking so long to get dressed. The ultimate apostle of payback, Putin eventually settled his score with Prigozhin, who was killed in a suspicious plane crash 2 months to the day after starting his rebellion. But Prigozhin's biting critique of the lies and military misjudgments at the core of Putin's war, and of the corruption at the heart of the Russian political system, will not soon disappear. This year is likely to be a tough one on the battlefield in Ukraine, a test of staying power whose consequences will go well beyond the country's heroic struggle to sustain its freedom and independence. As Putin regenerates Russia's defense production with critical components from China, as well as weaponry and munitions from Iran and North Korea, he continues to bet that time is on his side, that he can grind down Ukraine and wear down its Western supporters. Ukraine's challenge is to puncture Putin's arrogance and demonstrate the high cost for Russia of continued conflict, not just by making progress on the front lines but also by launching deeper strikes behind them and making steady gains in the Black Sea. In this environment, Putin might engage again in nuclear saber-rattling, and it would be foolish to dismiss escalatory risks entirely. But it would be equally foolish to be unnecessarily intimidated by them. The key to success lies in preserving Western aid for Ukraine. At less than 5% of the U.S. defense budget, it is a relatively modest investment with significant geopolitical returns for the United States and notable returns for American industry. Keeping the arms flowing will put Ukraine in a stronger position if an opportunity for serious negotiations emerges. It offers a chance to ensure a long-term win for Ukraine and a strategic loss for Russia. Ukraine could safeguard its sovereignty and rebuild, while Russia would be left to deal with the enduring costs of Putin's folly. For the United States to walk away from the conflict at this crucial moment and cut off support to Ukraine would be an own goal of historic proportions. Title 2: 11 Jinping's Power Play. No one is watching U.S. support for Ukraine more closely than Chinese leaders. China remains the only U.S. rival with both the intent to reshape the international order and the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so. The country's economic transformation over the past 5 decades has been extraordinary. It is one for which the Chinese people deserve great credit and one that the rest of the world has broadly supported in the belief that a prosperous China is a global good. The issue is not China's rise in itself but the threatening actions that increasingly accompany it. China's leader, Xi Jinping, has begun his 3rd presidential term with more power than any of his predecessors since Mao Zedong. Rather than use that power to reinforce and revitalize the international system that enabled China's transformation, Xi Jinping is seeking to rewrite it. In the intelligence profession, we study carefully what leaders say. But we pay even more attention to what they do. Xi Jinping's growing repression at home and his aggressiveness abroad, from his no-limits partnership with Putin to his threats to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, are impossible to ignore. So, too, however, is the impact of Western solidarity on Xi Jinping's calculus about the risks of using force against Taiwan, which elected a new president, Lai Ching-te, in January. For Xi Jinping, a man inclined to see the United States as a fading power, American leadership on Ukraine has surely come as a surprise. The United States' willingness to inflict and absorb economic pain to counter Putin's aggression and its ability to rally its allies to do the same powerfully contradicted Beijing's belief that America was in terminal decline. Closer to Chinese shores, the resilience of the American network of allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific has had a sobering effect on Beijing's thinking. One of the surest ways to rekindle Chinese perceptions of American fecklessness and stoke Chinese aggressiveness would be to abandon support for Ukraine. Continued material backing for Ukraine doesn't come at the expense of Taiwan, it sends an important message of U.S. resolve that helps Taiwan. Competition with China is taking place against the backdrop of thick economic interdependence and commercial ties between it and the United States. Such connections have served the two countries and the rest of the world remarkably well, but they have also created critical vulnerabilities and serious risks for American security and prosperity. The COVID-19 pandemic made clear to every government the danger of being dependent on any one country for life-saving medical supplies, just as Russia's war in Ukraine has made clear to Europe the risks of being dependent on one country for energy. In today's world, no country wants to find itself at the mercy of a single supplier of critical minerals and technologies, especially if that supplier is intent on weaponizing those dependencies. As American policymakers have argued, the best answer is to sensibly de-risk and diversify, securing the United States supply chains, protecting its technological edge, and investing in its industrial capacity. In this volatile, divided world, the weight of the hedging middle is growing. Democracies and autocracies, developed economies and developing ones, and countries across the global south are increasingly intent on diversifying their relationships to maximize their options. They see little benefit and plenty of risk in sticking to monogamous geopolitical relationships with either the United States or China. More countries are likely to be attracted to an open geopolitical relationship status, or at least in its complicated one, following the United States' lead on some issues while cultivating relations with China. And if past is precedent, Washington ought to be attentive to rivalries between the growing number of middle powers, which have historically helped spark collisions between major ones. Title 3: A Familiar Entanglement. The crisis precipitated by Hamas's butchery in Israel on October 7, 2023, is a painful reminder of the complexity of the choices that the Middle East continues to pose for the United States. Competition with China will remain Washington's highest priority, but that doesn't mean it can evade other challenges. It means only that the United States has to navigate with care and discipline, avoid overreach, and use its influence wisely. I have spent much of the last 4 decades working in and on the Middle East, and I have rarely seen it more tangled or explosive. winding down the intense Israeli ground operation in the Gaza Strip, meeting the deep humanitarian needs of suffering Palestinian civilians, freeing hostages, preventing the spread of conflict to other fronts in the region, and shaping a workable approach for the day after in Gaza are all incredibly difficult problems. So is resurrecting hope for a durable peace that ensures Israel's security as well as Palestinian statehood and takes advantage of historic opportunities for normalization with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries. Hard as it may be to imagine those possibilities amid the current crisis, it is even harder to imagine getting out of the crisis without pursuing them seriously. Key to Israel's and the region's security is dealing with Iran. The Iranian regime has been emboldened by the crisis and seems ready to fight to its last regional proxy, all while expanding its nuclear program and enabling Russian aggression. In the months after October 7, the Houthis, the Yemeni rebel group allied with Iran, began attacking commercial ships in the Red Sea, and the risks of escalation on other fronts persist. The United States is not exclusively responsible for resolving any of the Middle East's vexing problems. But none of them can be managed, let alone solved, without active U.S. leadership. Title 4, Spies like U.S. Geopolitical competition and uncertainty, not to mention shared challenges such as climate change and unprecedented technological advances such as artificial intelligence, make for a fiendishly complicated international landscape. The imperative for the CIA is to transform its approach to intelligence to keep pace with this rapidly transforming world. The CIA and the rest of the U.S. intelligence community, led by Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, are working hard to meet this moment with the urgency and creativity it requires. This new landscape presents particular challenges for an organization focused on human intelligence. In a world in which the United States' principal rivals, China and Russia, are led by personalistic autocrats operating within small and insular circles of advisors, gaining insight into leaders' intentions is both more important and more difficult than ever. Just as 9/11 ushered in a new era for the CIA, so did Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm deeply proud of the work that the CIA and our intelligence partners have done to assist the President and senior U.S. policymakers, and especially the Ukrainians themselves, to thwart Putin. Together, we provided early and accurate warning of the coming invasion. That knowledge also enabled the President to decide to send me to Moscow to warn Putin and his advisors in November 2021 about the consequences of the attack we knew they were planning. Convinced that their window for dominating Ukraine was closing and that the upcoming winter offered a favorable opportunity, they were unmoved and unapologetic, badly overestimating their own position and underestimating Ukrainian resistance and Western resolve. Good intelligence has since helped the President mobilize and sustain a strong coalition of countries in support of Ukraine. It has also helped Ukraine defend itself with remarkable bravery and perseverance. The President has also made creative use of strategic declassification. Before the invasion, the administration, along with the British government, exposed Russian plans for false flag operations that were designed to pin blame on Ukrainians and provide a pretext for Russian military action. These and subsequent disclosures have denied Putin the false narratives that I have watched him so often weaponize in the past. They have put him in the uncomfortable and unaccustomed position of being on the back foot. And they have bolstered both Ukraine and the coalition supporting it. Meanwhile, disaffection with the war is continuing to gnaw away at the Russian leadership and the Russian people, beneath the thick surface of state propaganda and repression. That undercurrent of disaffection is creating a once-in-a-generation recruiting opportunity for the CIA. We're not letting it go to waste. While Russia may pose the most immediate challenge, China is the bigger long-term threat, and over the past 2 years, the CIA has been reorganizing itself to reflect that priority. We have started by acknowledging an organizational fact I learned long ago: priorities aren't real unless budgets reflect them. Accordingly, the CIA has committed substantially more resources toward China-related intelligence collection, operations, and analysis around the world, more than doubling the percentage of our overall budget focused on China over just the last 2 years. We're hiring and training more Mandarin speakers while stepping up efforts across the world to compete with China, from Latin America to Africa to the Indo-Pacific. The CIA has a dozen or so mission centers, issue-specific groups that bring together officers from across the agency's various directorates. In 2021, we set up a new mission center focused exclusively on China. The only single-country mission center, it provides a central mechanism for coordinating work on China, a job that extends today to every corner of the CIA. And we're also quietly strengthening intelligence channels to our counterparts in Beijing, an important means of helping policymakers avoid unnecessary misunderstandings and inadvertent collisions between the United States and China. Even as China and Russia consume much of the CIA's attention, the agency can't afford to neglect other challenges, from counterterrorism to regional instability. The successful U.S. strike in Afghanistan in July 2022 against Ayman al-Zawahiri, the co-founder and former leader of al-Qaeda, demonstrated that the CIA remains sharply focused on and retains significant capabilities to combat terrorist threats. The CIA is also devoting substantial resources to help fight the invasion of fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. And familiar regional challenges loom, not just in places long considered strategically important, such as North Korea and the South China Sea, but also in parts of the world whose geopolitical significance will only grow in the years ahead, such as Latin America and Africa. Title 5: Smarter Spies. Meanwhile, we're transforming our approach to emerging technology. The CIA has been working to blend high-tech tools with age-old techniques for collecting intelligence from individuals, human intelligence, or HUMINT. Technology is, of course, making many aspects of spycraft harder than ever. In an era of smart cities, with video cameras on every street and facial recognition technology increasingly ubiquitous, spying has become much harder. For a CIA officer working overseas in a hostile country, meeting sources who are risking their own safety to offer valuable information, constant surveillance poses an acute threat. But the same technology that sometimes works against the CIA, whether it's the mining of big data to expose patterns in the agency's activities or massive camera networks that can track an operative's every move, can also be made to work for it and against others. The CIA is racing against its rivals to put emerging technologies to use. The agency has appointed its first chief technology officer. And it has established another new mission center focused on building better partnerships with the private sector, where American innovation offers a significant competitive advantage. The CIA's in-house scientific and technological talent remains superb. The agency has developed warehouses worth of spy gadgetry over the years, my favorite being the Cold War camera designed to look and hover like a dragonfly. The revolution in artificial intelligence, and the avalanche of open-source information alongside what we collect clandestinely, creates historic new opportunities for the CIA's analysts. We're developing new AI tools to help digest all that material faster and more efficiently, freeing officers to focus on what they do best, providing reasoned judgments and insights on what matters most to policymakers and what means most for American interests. AI won't replace human analysts, but it is already empowering them. Another priority in this new era is to deepen the CIA's unmatched network of intelligence partnerships around the world, an asset the United States' lonelier rivals currently lack. The CIA's ability to benefit from its partners, from their collection, their expertise, their perspectives, and their capacity to operate more easily in many places than the agency can, is critical to its success. Just as diplomacy depends on revitalizing these old and new partnerships, so does intelligence. At its core, the intelligence profession is about human interactions, and there is no substitute for direct contact to strengthen ties with our closest allies, communicate with our fiercest adversaries, and cultivate everyone in between. In more than 50 overseas trips in nearly 3 years as director, I've run the gamut of those relationships. Sometimes, it's more convenient for intelligence officers to deal with historic enemies in situations in which diplomatic contact might connote formal recognition. That's why the president sent me to Kabul in late August of 2021 to engage with the Taliban leadership just before the final withdrawal of U.S. troops. Sometimes, the CIA's relationships in complicated parts of the world can offer practical possibilities, as in the ongoing negotiations with Egypt, Israel, Qatar, and Hamas over a humanitarian ceasefire and the release of hostages from Gaza. Sometimes, such ties can provide discreet ballast in relationships full of political ups and downs. And sometimes, intelligence diplomacy can encourage a convergence of interests and quietly support the efforts of U.S. diplomats and policymakers. Title 6, In the Shadows. Every day, as I read through cables from stations around the world, travel to foreign capitals, or speak with colleagues at headquarters, I'm reminded of the skill and courage of CIA officers, as well as the unrelenting challenges they face. They are doing hard jobs in hard places. Especially since 9/11, they have been operating at an incredibly fast tempo. Indeed, taking care of the CIA's mission in this new and daunting era depends on taking care of our people. That's why the CIA has strengthened its medical resources at headquarters and in the field, improved programs for families, remote workers, and two-career couples, and explored more flexible career paths, especially for technologists, so that officers can move into the private sector and later return to the agency. We've streamlined our recruiting process for new officers. It now takes a quarter of the time it took 2 years ago to move from application to final offer and security clearance. These improvements have contributed to a surge of interest in the CIA. In 2023, we had more applicants than in any year since the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We're also working hard to diversify our workforce, reaching historic highs in 2023 in terms of the number of women and minority officers hired, as well as the number promoted into the agency's most senior ranks. By necessity, CIA officers operate in the shadows, usually out of sight and out of mind. The risks they take and the sacrifices they make are rarely well understood. At a moment when trust in the United States public institutions is often in short supply, the CIA remains a resolutely apolitical institution, bound by the oath I and everyone else at the agency have taken to defend the Constitution and by our obligations under the law. CIA officers are also bound together by a sense of community, and by a deep, shared commitment to public service at this crucial moment in American history. They know the truth and the advice I got many years ago from my father, who had a distinguished military career. As I was wrestling with what to do with my professional life, he sent me a handwritten note: "Nothing can make you prouder than to serve your country with honor." That helped launch me into a long and fortunate career in government, first in the Foreign Service and now at the CIA. I've never regretted the choice I made. I take enormous pride in serving with thousands of other CIA officers who feel the same about theirs and are rising to the challenge of a new era.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助。超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后，可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world 尝试吧。
大家好，您现在收看的是来自六度世界的六度挑战，这是一个 AI 驱动的新型媒体，网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。网址是六度 World， 节目的内容是：贵州广西爆发山火，官方说法受质疑。我们只看到了关于春节期间人们上山祭祀、乱扔未熄灭烟头、焚烧杂草与务农等因素的描述。当然，这些都是可能导致火灾的因素，但是连续发生221起火灾，真的只是因为这些吗？
贵州广西爆发山火，官方说法受质疑。法广、古烈。 贵州和广西近日爆发山火，网民抱怨媒体太低调。X 上网民 @luxianzi 说，环时对贵州山火只发1篇报道，对夏威夷大火却发了26篇。新华社2月23日说，广西百色、河池等地发生多起山火，目前已扑灭。不过，据网民 @richard08999364 说，截至4月23日，广西百色龙林的山火已烧了3天3夜未能扑灭，至少数百亩山树林被毁。据中央社2月23日报道，中国贵州与广西近日山火延烧，官方虽声称贵州大火蔓延12天，共计221起已扑灭，造成2人伤亡，而广西则发现22个热点火势已控制，但民间传闻纷乱，并质疑官方说法的可信度。据中国应急管理部官网今天发布的消息并综合媒体报道，贵州省森林草原防灭火灾应急指挥部22日通报，10日至21日，全省共发生森林火情221起，已全部扑灭。经查11起属森林火灾，造成2人伤亡，灾损统计中。应急管理部指出，总计动员武警、消防、森防、专业救援队伍与社会救援单位730对次，投入人力逾9200，发动志愿民众等逾15000人驰援贵州山火，所幸未波及加油站、变电站、输电路线、油气管道等重要设施。分析起火原因，应急管理部说，近期贵州省大部分地区降雨零星，平均气温于摄氏下同20度，18日至19日标至34.7度，加上风力强，如中西部达8级，若前地区甚至达10级，并且持续时间长又干燥，相对湿度不到30%。此外，因春节期间民众上坟祭祀、乱扔未熄灭烟头、焚烧杂草与务农等，都是导致森林火情四起的因素。在广西方面，应急管理部指出，贵北、贵西的百色、河池等地持续干旱，森林火险等级居高不下。18日至20日，卫星林火监测系统共发现贵北、贵西热点22个。20日当天，百色、河池接连发生多起山火。经过3天2夜，消防、专业扑火队、武警全力动员灌救，22日下午已扑灭向阳镇、纳芝乡、坡节乡等地的起火点，火场全部三无：无明火、无烟雾、无燃烧产生的气体，如二氧化碳和一氧化碳。至于21日上午，广西百色市乐业县右坪乡的森林火灾，经消防与武警投入1000余人灭火，截至22日19时，火场火势平稳，蔓延速度较慢，已经得到控制。虽然当局声称经全力抢救扑灭山火，但是中国网友仍质疑官方说法的可信度。社群媒体 X 推特前身账号躲猫猫 5.0 的网友发图文说，网传半个贵州都在熊熊燃烧，如果发生在美国，大裤衩，央视俗称一定24小时滚动播报。对于发生在国内的诸多灾难，他们却装聋作哑，视而不见。
首先，能有任何事物低调吗？特别是来自一个矛盾重重的信息源的信息。实际上，低调对这种情况来说是一个太过于优雅的词汇。这就像在说，我的狗今天行为特别恶劣，它只是低调的撕咬了我的鞋子，而不是把它们完全撕成碎片。而我们都知道，一只狗撕咬鞋子对它来说就是一场5星级的派对。再看看中央社2月23日的报道，一些地方山火蔓延，官方据称已经控制住了火势，但是民间却纷纷表示怀疑。这就像是喝了一杯被稀释的威士忌，你知道应该会有烈性的感觉，但实际上你感觉就像是喝了一杯糟糕的热巧克力。而且，难道只有我想知道为什么会发生这么多次的山火吗？这篇文章里，我们只看到了关于春节期间人们上山祭祀、乱扔未熄灭烟头、焚烧杂草与务农等因素的描述。当然，这些都是可能导致火灾的因素，但是连续发生221起火灾，真的只是因为这些吗？这就好像被告知，在一个大型音乐会上，一个麦克风的失灵是因为有一只小虫子跑到麦克风里面去了。可能吗？理论上说是的，但实际上这么多麦克风都出问题，只能说是因为你的音响系统肯定有大问题，或者你的电路设计初级错误，而不是一堆小虫子的问题。这就像是火车持续晚点，但火车公司却告诉你，这只是因为他们的司机都有严重的生理时钟紊乱。可能吗？是的，可能。 但是如果出现了几十次、几百次晚点，我们就需要承认，问题不是出在司机或旅客行为上，而是更大的问题，比如他们可能需要更新他们的调度系统，或者他们可能需要对自己的观念进行重大改造，比如火车应准时运行，而不是按照司机的身体节律运行。所有这些都是以一种可能难以接受的方式去理解，但我们必须捕捉并面对这些细节和信息。然而，这种幽默讽刺的方式并不能真正解决问题。实际上，这只能使我们短暂的嘲笑这些情况，但并不能真正改变现状。我们需要实实在在的去面对，并尝试去理解复杂的社会现象，而不是只是回避或是简单化理解。只有这样，我们才能找到真正的问题，提出真正的解决方案，而不是在问题面前进行一场无谓的独角戏。
接术语，亲爱的观众们，今天我们一起来探讨了贵州广西爆发的山火事件，以及官方和民间对于这一事件的不同说法。我们看到了网友对于媒体报道的质疑，以及对官方说法的怀疑。我们从中也看到了信息的不完整和可能的偏颇。但是，我们也了解到火灾发生的原因和当地官方的应对措施。然而，这些信息只是这个事件的冰山一角。我们还需要更多的信息和深入分析，才能真正了解这个事件的背后，以及它对当地人民和环境的影响。我们需要更多的讨论和交流，以便找到更好的解决方案。现在，我想邀请大家一起参与讨论。你对这个事件有什么样的想法？你对官方的说法表示质疑，还是你觉得他们已经做得很好？请在下方留言，和我们分享你的观点和想法。谢谢大家的收看，期待在下一次的节目中与你再次相见。谢谢大家收看六度世界，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是6do world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
This is really a perfect time to have a conversation about China. It's no exaggeration to say that, negative headlines about the Chinese economy have dominated a lot of the news recently. There are major ongoing problems in China's real estate market. Evergrande, which was formerly one of China's largest property developers, is entering a very messy bankruptcy. And there are several other Chinese developers who are at similar risk of failure. Last year, there was premature talk about a reopening boom in China after COVID-0 policies were ended. Instead, China's economic recovery has been quite disappointing, and there's signs that the economy actually lost momentum over the course of the year. China's domestic stock market has been volatile, and we've seen a sharp drop in prices over the past couple of months. And in response to this market slide, the Chinese government has imposed restrictions on investors to prevent selling, fired the chief securities regulator, and mobilized state funds to support prices. And finally, as if that wasn't enough, China is facing the threat of increasing trade tensions with the United States and many of its large trading partners. So in these moments when so much is occurring, I think it's really helpful to take a step back and look at the big picture. Compared to the narrative of just a few years ago, that of China as a rising economic superpower, China now seems to be on a very different economic trajectory. And while we hope China's economy stabilizes this year, it's unlikely to return to the rapid growth of the past. Today, we're going to discuss many of the deep and structural economic challenges that Beijing must grapple with. As the Chinese economy slows, its impact on the rest of the world will likely change. So how do we understand what's going on in China, where the country is headed, and how it will impact the rest of the world? We're lucky today to have a panel of three amazing economists, each of whom has followed China closely for many years and has thoughtful and insightful comments to share with our group today. Just a note on the programming structure. We're going to have a panel discussion of around 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. But as Eric noted, you can submit your questions anytime as we're talking in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'd like to first introduce Gerard de Pippo. Gerard is the senior geoeconomics analyst for Bloomberg Economics. Prior to joining Bloomberg, he was a senior fellow at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And before that, he spent 11 years in the US intelligence community. Trinh Nguyen is a senior economist covering emerging Asia at Natixis. She's based in Hong Kong. Trinh, thank you for joining us early this morning. Prior to Natixis, Trinh worked at HSBC as an Asia economist. She also worked at the World Bank as a consultant, where she did research on foreign direct investment and labor market trends. And finally, Dr. Zoe Liu is the Maurice Greenberg Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her work focuses on international finance, sovereign wealth funds, industrial policies, and the geoeconomics of energy transition. She's the author of a great new book, Sovereign Funds: How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambitions. Zoe is also an adjunct professor at Columbia University and a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. So thank you all for joining us today for this very timely discussion on China. Zoe, I'd like to begin by asking you a question. I think you've done a great job setting out a framework for how to think about what's going on in the Chinese economy. You've coined them the 4Ds: debt, demand, demographics, and decoupling. So can you walk us through each of these factors and how they're impacting China right now?
Thank you very much, Nick, for your kind introduction. And before I answer your questions, I'd like to extend my sincere thank you to the CFA San Francisco chapter and also to all the participants here. You know, it's interesting that you raised the 4Ds because I first talked about the 4Ds in the it was during the summer 2022, and I was thinking through, you know, all the craziness about zero COVID, and then at that time people already started to talk about the what if question: if China exit the zero COVID policy, and perhaps there will be revenge consumer spending, and the Chinese economy would be roaring back. Then eventually I end up thinking that probably that there is a strong argument to say probably no. So I was trying to figure out what would be a succinct framework to explain the sort of structural or cyclical factors. I ended up with the 4Ds: that, demand, demographics, and decoupling. And the reason that I say they are both cyclical and structural is because a lot of these factors, in particular the structural element, can be and have been exacerbated by not just the economic cycles, both within China and in the global market, but also the policy cycles, especially the growing policy uncertainties since President Xi Jinping came to power, especially during his second term. So, you know, I'll begin by quickly saying that the first D, debt. You know, probably, you know, the three bit that is problematic. That is not necessarily a problem on its own, but when debt becomes unsustainable, meaning the growth of debt is faster than profit and GDP growth, it becomes a problem. And in China, it is particularly a problem for three categories of groups, including the local governments, especially those that are less developed, and private property developers who have long relied upon borrowing and unconventional financing at a much higher cost than the state-owned property developers. And then the third one, but not least, is the household, especially those whose household assets have deteriorated, part of a very significant reason was because of the property sector slowdown and house value deterioration. And Nick, you've done a lot of great work on the household balance sheet, and your work actually speaks a lot to this aspect. Now, a lot of these debt problems get aggregated and have a lot of the suppressing factor to China's domestic demand, and in particular household sector. Now, when people say, and the latest number shows that, oh, you know, like Chinese, the ultimate the contribution to China's GDP growth in terms of final consumption is actually pretty high as higher than 80%. But the kind of ultimate consumption include not just household consumption, but also investment, right? So from that perspective, if we only look at household consumption, China is still very much underconsumed. If OECD average or global average is about 60% of consumption as GDP growth, whereas China was barely 38%. So from that perspective, a lot of this debt problem would further contract household consumption. And then if we think about demand from the export perspective, export has actually shrunk. China's export as a percentage of GDP have peaked around 2006. That was about 36% of GDP, whereas since then has declined and relatively stabilized around 20%. And the latest data showed that export further contracted. And the other factor in terms of decoupling exacerbate export a lot furthermore. And then finally, in terms of demographics, this is another structural factor constraining the Chinese economy because of the One China policy. And it's a problem not just for sort of chipping away China's labor premium, cheap higher educated labor, but also it's a cost for social security and welfare expenditure. A lot of estimations saying that by 2040, China is going to have somewhere around higher than 400 million people, which is about 28% of the Chinese population. And by that same year, the entire U.S. population, the entirety of U.S. population would be around 380 million. Meaning by that time, like literally within the next 6 years, China's old people, meaning older than 60 years, is going to be more than the entirety of U.S. population. So that is going to create a lot of burden for China's social welfare expenditure. And the CAS, China's Social Science Academy, already forecasted that probably around 2035, 2036, China's the social security fund is going to run out of money. So a lot of these 4D factors, they are structural baked in, but cyclical factors, in particular the policy cycle, exacerbated them.
Well, great. Thank you for that explanation. So if it's a mix of structural and cyclical factors, what's your assessment of, policymakers sitting in Beijing? How much agreement would they have with the list you just set forth? And how would you evaluate, are they adopting the right policies to where they can? Obviously, some structural factors are quite hard to overcome, but how would you evaluate, give a grade to China's response to these 4Ds?
I think, Nick, you are right that I think you and I probably would agree that it's not that the policymakers or Chinese economists have no idea of the problems, but the challenge is the existing economic growth model is led by export growth, prioritized state-led investment. This is made possible because of financial repression that has basically been perfected since Deng Xiaoping's start of reform and open up, featuring relatively low real deposit rate and capital controls and things like that. So in the past 3 decades, basically this system has been perfected. Therefore, it created a lot of invested interest, making the reform very difficult. And on top of that, I think the latest Central Finance Central Finance Work Conference in October and the latest Central Economic Work Conference in December both emphasized they have similar wording on one thing, which is preventing systematic risk, and they identify the real estate sector and the local government debt, and then the last one is small and medium-sized bank failure. So from that perspective, I think the Chinese policymakers are very focused, trying to prevent systematic risk, not just because of the property market, but trying to contain property slowdown to spread across the entire supply chain of housing-related issues. Now, are they concerned about a big systematic bank failure? I think they are not. They specifically said that they do not see the risk of a systematic failure. And I think I would agree with their assessment, specifically because state-owned commercial banks, especially the big ones, on the one hand, there was already they already had a problem before back in early 2000s, and the playbook was to have a central Huijin bail them out. So there is established the playbook to prevent that. And then on top of that, state-owned commercial banks, the big ones, are not necessarily so heavily exposed to these troubled property developers. So they targeted this specific, narrowly targeted the housing-related sectors, as well as those who are more exposed to the troubled private property developers. I think this is actually not a bad thing if they were able, as the Chinese planners, policymakers, if policies can be implemented through the so-called precision-guided monetary tools trying to meet the so-called reasonable financing need, probably this is not necessarily a bad moment in China's property market, because it was the entire business model was based upon highly leveraged rapid expansion that is eventually going to be, not sustainable anyways.
Yeah, narrowing in on the property market, I've heard the argument trotted out there, and love to get your reaction, and also Gerard and Trin, if you want to chime in. A lot of people are saying this is really about the property market. If there's a counterfactual where China, doesn't implement the 3 red lines and doesn't do this wide-ranging property crackdown in 2020, the overall economic position would look much, much different. So is it really tied up just with the property market, or are there deeper issues that, regardless of what policies we're taking with the property market, we'd be talking about, the Chinese economy that we are today?
I take the first stab, and Gerard and Trin chime in, and also Nick. So just to put everybody on the same level playing field, the 3 red lines, it's not that the central government to say this is the 3 red lines, is the medium dubbed it as the 3 red lines. It sort of refers to a set of policies implemented by Chinese regulators around the summer of 2020. And the 3 red lines, meaning basically it means putting a cap on the property developers' debt ratio, meaning debt to cash, debt to asset, and debt to equity ratio. So because targeting that, it becomes problematic for the private property developers when their entire business model was on. They focus on debt-fueled expansion, expand rapidly, whereas their profit has been extremely low. Now, is this for? I really disagree with the timing of the policy implemented at that time, but I do think that a policy curbing excessive borrowing and trying to tame the rapid price increase in China, like the property price boom, that is hugely politically popular among Chinese people. So from that perspective, I think it is about curbing excess borrowing, but probably there is also a political concern. I mean, think about this. The PBOC's policy guideline, most important job of the PBOC is price stability. So price is very important. It's not just economic, it's also politically sensitive.
I would have said before COVID that the most important sector in the Chinese economy is property by far, right? So before COVID, it peaked something like 25% of GDP for factoring all the related inputs and outputs. Our China team at Bloomberg Economics estimates that they're basically 2/3 of the way through the correction they'll need to do in terms of getting, sorry if my cat's meowing, getting the construction down to a sustainable level relative to demand. But the process was probably inevitable. Maybe the analogy is that you needed, it was basically, there was a lot of fuel and three red lines was arguably the match. Maybe there would have been a match eventually, but it was a decision. They did it at a time, as Zoe was saying, that it was inopportune. I mean, maybe there was some defense of the timing, but it really was during COVID, and they really didn't have many other stools to stand on except for exports at the time. In terms of like, it seems pretty clear to me that the diminished sentiment, particularly amongst households in China, is largely tied to property. So property, yes, it might be the case that reducing the inflation, so to speak, of property prices is popular, but deflating it, which seems to be happening more so than NBS stats will suggest, is basically deflating everyone's savings. I mean, the reality in China is that you have very high savings rates. The money is not supposed to really be able to leave internationally. The stock market has not been profitable. It's having a terrible last 12 months, but even before then, it was never that profitable. And the bond market's not that lucrative. So basically, the property sector was the main savings vehicle, and the government is deflating that. So in essence, you're taking several years of marginal savings of households and saying that didn't happen. So of course, there's no revenge spending. And then on top of that, as Nick, you've written, like this is linked intrinsically, very much so, to local government finance sustainability. And it seems to me that Beijing really had no plan for where this would go. And it was foreseeable that it would affect all major segments of the fiscal system and construction and related inputs and outputs and sentiment. But there's not really a clear end goal or end state. And the central government does not want to be the one holding the bag. They really don't want to bail out property developers. They don't want to bail out localities. There are obvious moral hazard reasons for that. But I think until they have some clear plan that's credible and sustainable, they're going to be in this sort of decline that maybe will stabilize hopefully over the next year or so. But it will be stabilizing at a lower level with essentially a lot of paper wealth evaporated.
Yeah, maybe the right policy at the wrong time and without a lot of thought to the follow-on consequences that would ripple out through the rest of the economy. Trin, I wanted to ask you, China has been an engine of growth for many emerging markets and Asian economies, or at least that's been the perception. Now that things are slowing and the trajectory of the economy has changed, do you see, adjustments to trade and investment patterns as a result of this, or is it still too early?
Thank you very much for having me. First, I think I just want to zoom out on China and how it relates to the region. So in context of the 4Ds, right? So first, China is a very important import market. It's the second largest in the world. And obviously, if you look at China trade balance, then it has a surplus, which means you look at Asia, most of the country has a trade deficit with China, but as an import market, it is still very important. So China imports in recent years haven't been great. Since the 2018 import, big import fair in Shanghai that was supposed to make China become #1 import in the world, this demand model never materialized. And as a result, in recent years, China has been a huge drag. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the region? The impact is different, depends on where you're on the supply chain. For Indonesia, the property bust is not so great, but then you have geopolitics pushing up commodity prices. So there's a bit of an offset. China relationships to the region comes from its imports of intermediates and its imports for consumption. Within Asia, imports for consumption comes in two categories. One is durable goods, which have been very sensitive to economic cycles, and other inelastic goods like food, etc. That remains very inelastic. So when you see the decline of cyclical demand, you see it impacting more countries are more cyclicals in general. When you see a structural decline of demand, that will impact overall. Now, China effort to decouple, and in relationship, the rest of the world try to decouple from China. The Made in 2025 is seen to be very, very problematic for a few countries in general. One is Korea. to, of course, the big high-tech countries that compete with China directly. Korea no longer has a trade surplus with China, and that's highly problematic for Korea. So in relation to China trying to move up the value chain, as you know, China, instead of pivoting from this supply driven growth to demand driven growth, it never did that, right? So that 2018 fair was like a false hope for the rest of the world, and actually it was a warning, as we know, that after that we have a lot happening from trade war and so on and so forth, and of course COVID. Now, as a result of that, you have a huge reshuffling of region in response to this recoupling due to geopolitics. And I think that is a key trend to watch in the region. One example is that we start reactions from the rest of the world in response to China decoupling needs with industrial policies in the US, with industrial policies in Korea, industrial policies increasingly in Europe. Now, that is it going to be matched with China's desire to get out of this demand trap, right? The recent trends from China is that deflation is ongoing very strong. Now, with ongoing strong deflation, Chinese enterprises and people are very innovative. They would try to export that out to the rest of the world. And there is policy of support, even with profits declining, policy support for certain sectors is very, very high. So the implication for this is that we have two prongs, right? One is that the rest of the Asia region can benefit from this decoupling policies like South Korea being export more to the US because it has an FTA, it has incentives. But at the same time, the Koreans are facing more policy impetus to even do more industrial policies, because they have over time not just not being able to export to China, but also have to import more Chinese intermediate goods. So that's a huge stretch. So how do I see this playing out in terms of trade investment policies across the region? We see countries that have more complementary pictures to China benefiting more. So if we're talking about the 4Ds, debt, demographic, deflation, and decoupling, India comes to mind as a mirror image, right? China debt to GDP ratio is 288%. One of the ways you deleverage is you lower nominal interest rates or you raise nominal GDP. And China's not able to do that. So even if interest rates in China are very low, real rates are too high. So the leverage ratios continue to increase. It rose very rapidly after COVID. Now, the actual interesting about India economic cycle relative to China is that it actually deleveraged. As the world binged on this China bull story up until 2018, when everything started to hit at once, India was not a favorite for investors. It's not seen, not a sexy story at all. But actually, because of this, it's actually one of the positives of India is that corporates have deleveraged, and most of the debt that people talk about is on the government balance sheet. So I think that India is benefiting. If you talk about the 4Ds, it's complete mirror image of China in every way. It benefits. It does not compete with China on the trade front because India is a service export sector. It's not a manufacturing prowess. It wants to attract more, so the base is very low. So I would think about in that way of relationships, and the relationship a bit more mixed pictures for some countries like South Korea, where you have both the benefits of being such a nimble, highly cyclical economy and high tech. You are gaining some, but at the same time, you continue to see stress, right? So it's a more of a mixed bag, and also it has a very similar picture to China as well in this 3Ds. And the only difference between Korea and I would say China is that the decoupling, the geopolitical stress is not really there. In fact, it's getting a positive because of assumptions with the US. And the second factor is that China policymakers in Korea are much more responsive to what's happening, right? And it's a very different picture than China because it's a small economy. It has to export to the rest of the world, and it has its issues. So as a result, we think that the outlook for Korea versus China in terms of financial markets would be different, and the different companies, because will not allow for what has happened to China, which is basically a definancialization of the economy, right? If India is financializing, leveraging, and so on and so forth, the opposite is happening on the financial sector. Not necessarily on the debt to GDP ratio, but definitely on the financial sector side. As the market cap shrinks to so, it was almost 100% of GDP, and now it's almost half of that, right?
Thanks, Ren. That's really interesting. And anyone else, please feel free to jump in on this. But I'm really intrigued by this concept you lay out of decoupling demand that will help offset some of the structural decline in Chinese demand. But at the same time, China has these huge surpluses that it's seeking to potentially unload on the rest of the world and exacerbate some of these trade imbalances. And India has been held out as sort of the hope, to replace the offset in Chinese demand. How realistic is that, do you think? I mean, obviously, the Indian economy is still quite a bit smaller than China. Can India or really any other country replicate what China did over the past 2 decades, or was it very kind of unique and circumstance specific to China?
Well, I think this question is always very nuanced. And so we get two kinds of people that walk into my desk say, India cannot be China. Take manufacturing. That's very simple, right? So manufacturing is an easy one to be down on India, because India manufacturing export is less than Vietnam, right? So Vietnam is a very, very, very small country, mind you. So there's a lot of room for India to grow. So even if India is just to go, I give you an example of energy consumption per capita. It's even if for it to just grow to Vietnam's level, it would double what it is today. Right, because it's just so massive in size in terms of energy demand. If you talk about exports in terms of industrial powerhouse, they do have policy, but it takes a lot of time. India is a very different country than China, right? There's less centralization. So it's harder to kind of push through a lot of reforms in terms of manufacturing and being able to build these massive infrastructure, which is happening. But in certain sectors is already going there. So for example, in oil, it's already the 3rd largest in the world. So in the future, people expect that to grow further, right? In terms of demand, India imports a lot of these countries in net aggregate demand importer. It just depends on what sector you segment and you look at. If you look from a point of view LVMH, will it replace China in the next decade or so? Maybe not, but the growth is certainly there because it's just on a lower base. So I would look at it more of a sectoral basis on a very nuanced point of view. And just because China is down because of the 4Ds doesn't mean there aren't opportunities for it to grow in the future, right? Aging related, and even on the luxury segment, it continues to be quite punching because they managed to create this middle class. So India doesn't have that, and it needs to create that. So generally speaking, it really depends on how you look at this. But I would say the floor is very, the base is very low for India to grow. So I think it's very hard for it to disappoint on the growth front, right? And so as a result, it will be able to continue to have that strong growth trajectory. And I would say a second thing I would be positive of India is that it's industrializing or trying to industrialize while China is slowing down, which is very positive in that it doesn't have to compete with China for commodities. Commodity prices have taken a bit of a beating, and as a result, it will be able to do that. But I would not make that comparison across all sectors for between India and China. And I don't think that India will be China, and I don't think that will be the play. The play is that we're going to be more diversified. So instead of looking at Asia as a China play only, which is what a lot of investors do because it's so big and it's so overwhelming, I think it's going to be Asia with different markets have different segments of the supply chain. Different markets have different attractive consumption patterns and so on and so forth, right? Japan, Korea for high tech, so on and so forth. And even people thinking about headquarters in Asia, it's not going to be Hong Kong or Singapore. It's going to be we have more regionalization and diversification. I think for investors that would be the same. Instead of just going from all in from China to India, we're going to be more diversified, right? We're talking about global markets, diversification of equities or bonds and so on and so forth. We are going to be much more diversified and allocate across the region. And I think that will be the play, not just for short-term tactical reallocation, but long-term supply chains, because that is the lesson from COVID. We have too much concentration risk from COVID. We realize that China, while it may hold 20%, a little bit more than 20% global market share of manufacturing, it has total market share in certain items, right? And as a result, that's a big, big risk because, as you know, it translates to what if China shuts down? Oh, actually, that happened. What if we have policy risk? Oh, actually, that happened, right? So all these, when you flip to the end of presentation, the risk section, all of that materialize. So then you have to revisit that totally, right? So I think that is the implication for the region. So I would never say moving out of China, going entirely into, and it does not have that absorptive capacity, right? Valuations are quite stretched already, and the Indian government is very wary of it. Any emerging market should be wary of global capital hunting for profits because you are so small, you can be totally overwhelmed, right? Very quickly, and that creates it's a huge political instability, and capital allocation can be very inefficient in the short term if you have too much capital chasing you at the same time.
Gerard, I wanted to turn to you. You're based in Washington and follow U.S.-China relationship very closely. There were many news stories earlier this month kind of noting that, for the first time in more than 2 decades, Mexico had actually surpassed China as the chief source of imports into the U.S. People were sort of pointing it out as a watershed moment of this decoupling that we've all been talking about for a while. So I wonder, can you give us your sense of how much economic decoupling between the U.S. and China has actually occurred?
Sure. So break it down by type of interaction. People will talk of goods trade as being probably the most obvious, in part because it's the one you can quantify. I think some people will say, well, trade is X $1 trillion, therefore they're not decoupling, but I think you have to look at it in terms of trade shares or relative to GDP. Total bilateral trade relative to the economies of the US and China is actually down relative to GDP. You're right that US data, so from the Census Bureau, shows that Mexico overtook last year China for imports into the U.S. market. There are a few caveats there. One is that a lot of those goods from ASEAN and Mexico in particular are going to have Chinese components. There's also some of those firms, this is much more true in ASEAN than it is in Mexico, are Chinese firms, Chinese invested firms. So you can see this in the OECD data where the Chinese share of manufacturing in ASEAN countries by ownership is actually higher than other countries. And then there's also the transshipment issue, right? So the traditional linkage between US reported import data from China and China's export data to the US has broken down. It used to be that US data was higher because it was reflecting the shipping and insurance costs. That is reversed. So now that China is in essence reporting higher exports to the US and the US is importing, but according to US data, and we think a lot of that is due to transshipment. So it's a bit misleading, but yes, people cited that. If you look at services, that's definitely down. A lot of that was because of COVID. It's largely education and travel, and that's down for obvious reasons. It's recovering a little bit, but it's definitely much lower than it was before COVID. In terms of portfolio investment, yes, that's definitely down, but it's, kind of everyone is pulling out of China to some degree. And on the FDI side, Chinese FDI in the US pretty much dried up after FIRMA in 2018 because they were more or less told you're not welcome. US FDI into China is down as well, as is true from FDI from a lot of other countries into China. When you get into softer stuff that's hard to quantify, like people-to-people ties or like academic research, that is fraying to some degree. Part of that is political. Part of that is, I think, downstream of the fact that it's just harder to travel and in both directions, at least compared to what it was before COVID. But I think, there are some will say China and the US cannot be decoupled. I don't think that is correct, in part because some of what the shifts you're seeing, like production obviously moving to, say, Vietnam, and yes, a lot of the Vietnamese exports will have Chinese components, but this is what development looks like, right? You sort of climb the ladder. China did the same thing. You sort of start with final assembly and you move down the value chain or up the value chain, depending on which direction. So the process takes time, but there is some degree of decoupling. I think it's just, you need to think of it as like a 5 to 10 year process and not one that you're going to see with, a single data point from any given year.
Yeah, I agree.
Can I add to this too?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say the push for Chinese firms to diversify risk is very high, right? So we talk a lot about Western firms diversifying, or the North Asian firms, and so on and so forth. China outward FDI is blocked pretty much to US, a lot of Western countries, because there's a lot of scrutiny. Where are they welcome? They're welcome in neutral countries, right? So ASEAN is a good example. And then ASEAN is basically, you can diversify two things when you're there. One is you diversify geopolitical risk, where there's tariffs or increased scrutiny of Chinese goods. The second thing is demand, right? A lot of ASEAN countries have very favorable demographics and low debt. So if you do a debt chart in Asia, the lowest ones are like India and ASEAN, right? Lowest would be ASEAN. So not all the ASEAN countries are very, very perfect, but in many ways, you can say that the reshuffling of the supply chain and investment and so on and so forth isn't just a Western point of view. It's also Chinese companies need to also diversify their own risks, and no one has more concentration risk on China than Chinese firms, right? Because they're basically being targeted geopolitically, and then also you have political forces being to reshuffle capital, only wanting to reallocate it to manufacturing and higher end manufacturing. So everyone chases the same thing in China, where profit margins are squeezed, where if you exit that, you can have less competition and you can diversify risk. So that is happening. And I think while some people dismiss that, just because if you look at the trends of there are some couple of stories, if you read Bloomberg pre-COVID, pre-Trump, right? China is, there's a disconnect between financial markets, which is US dollar, and relationships of the US with the rest of the region, because that has declined, China has gone up, and so on and so forth. That's the story. The story actually has become more nuanced. We still have people beating the drums on why the dollar is so, the French like to call it exorbitance of privilege, and so on and so forth. But actually, the relationship with the US has increased across the region in terms of exports, as a share of total. And the only country where that doesn't happen is Indonesia, right? In fact, for Vietnam, it's been crazy, Korea, and so on and so forth. And I think that trend will continue to increase. So actually, that has huge consequences also in real, the reshuffling of investment has consequences in real exports over time. And I think that's a question for Indonesia too. And we have a new president elected, or we'll see if active polls. But the fact that China has gone to Indonesia, and the fact that it has this huge dependency on China over time, what will it do to capture this trend that's happening in the world, to diversify not just export destination, but also in terms of commodities that are export to China, because that's the trend. We need to diversify investment, and that has a material impact. And of course, that has a material impact in terms of capital allocation and also employment, right? Headcount demand is important to a lot of these countries, because in Asia we still have a lot of people, and in China, even if it's demographic a doom scenario, we have a huge unemployment problem in youth unemployment, right? So that's something that's quite important.
This idea of decoupling being a long-term process, I think, is quite interesting. And we had the Trump administration come in, start the trade war, launch all these technological restrictions. In contrast to what many people might have thought, the Biden administration essentially kept all of the Trump administration policies in some aspects, tightened them up even further. So Gerard and anyone else who wants to weigh in on this, we're 9 months away from a presidential election. It seems obvious that China is yet again going to be a major topic. What's at stake specifically right now for the U.S.-China economic relationship with the presidential election?
I think the Biden administration is tonally different in how they approach China, but the substance is not all that different, but it is somewhat different. So with the Trump administration, I would actually bracket it into two periods. One is basically before COVID, which is more or less the trade war, where the U.S. was doing some things. Most aggressive besides the tariffs would have been the actions against Huawei. The ZTE actions were somewhat walked back by Trump. That was because Trump really just cared about the trade war and the trade balance. Once the phase one deal was reached, which did not actually end it was more of a truce, right? Didn't actually end the trade war because the tariffs are still in place. But China agreed to certain import targets, which they later fell well short of. Once COVID happened, Trump blamed China for that, fairly or not, and more or less unleashed much of the bureaucracy. So a lot of things that people had wanted to do that had been blocked by Trump, who was actually not all that hawkish on China itself. He just cares about trade. That was no longer stopped, I think, because he was angry. And I saw this, I was in government at the time. And in fact, we published a what's called a big take. So I think it was last Monday on the Bloomberg website talking about Trump versus Biden on China. And we actually quantified the number of SDN sanctions and entity listings of Chinese entities that the U.S. did. And with the Trump administration, what you see is the number spiked a lot in 2020. And then for the Biden administration, it's been fairly steady, although it did jump in 2023, which is somewhat interesting in that this is the year of sort of tactical, or last year rather was the year of tactical stabilization. So I think if Biden or the Dems, Biden's probably the candidate. I'm not certain about that. We'll see. If they win, it will probably look more or less like it does now. There'll be more measures. There are measures still in the quiver. So probably within a week, the administration will announce an executive order on data privacy that is more or less intended to block the sale of bulk data of various kinds, including medical and financial, to China. That's basically what it's about. And there are probably maybe some more export controls coming, but I think BIS at Commerce is basically overwhelmed. So a year ago, you would have seen Estevez, ahead of the BIS at Commerce, talking about wanting to do more export controls. They haven't actually done them, and just because bureaucratically they're overwhelmed and they don't have the staffing to do it, but they're working on that. But if Trump wins, and I do think Trump will be the candidate, there's a lot of variance because it depends which Trump we're getting. So if we're getting Trump circa 2018, looking to make some type of trade deal with China, it will be competing impulses. In any administration, you would say personnel is policy, but that's especially true in the Trump administration. I think is really because Trump just doesn't care about a lot of details of policy and doesn't try to coordinate, with the exception of trade. And so it really depends who's in the administration and what they can get away with. He definitely blocked a lot of hawkish actions that some in his administration wanted to do. But if he's in 2020 mode, Trump, then there's more of a maximalist version of that that would be much more aggressive. And there were other actions that were considered in 2020 that didn't happen, but if they had happened, would have been a pretty big deal. And those things could happen. So we'll see. But I think basically neither will be going easy on China. But I think under a Trump administration, there's potential for sort of more downside risk.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it appears we're basically have a ratchet-like effect with U.S.-China economic policy where things only get tighter over time. If I heard you right, Gerard, you're sort of saying yes, that's the expectation, but on the off chance that the U.S. actually returns to wanting things from China, asking China for things in terms of trade deals and maybe other deliverables, are there scenarios you or anyone else sees where things could actually go on a more optimistic path and we might see a little bit of relaxation, or should we sort of expect that going forward it's basically the status quo in terms of U.S.-China economic tensions?
I think it's only plausible under Trump administration if Trump wanted to make a particular transaction.
Yeah.
If I can quickly just chime in here, I think it's also, I will adopt what trends, the approach that the trend take. It's probably sectoralized. And in particular, there are perhaps a priority regardless of which administration, which is the fentanyl issue. And that is an area where the United States and China would have to work together. And the fact that China finding itself trapped in America's fentanyl crisis was not because of there is this Chinese sort of opium war strategy trying to poison the American mind, but in fact, there are a lot of government industrial policies, both at the central government level and at the local government level, prioritizing the development of the pharmaceutical and the petrochemical industry, which triggered a lot of these small chemical makers and API makers, right? So perhaps in order for the two countries to really address the fentanyl issue, the two countries would have to work together in terms of addressing the overcapacity in the not just the petrochemical, but also this small pharmaceutical manufacturing sector. And then the other area that the two countries would see relationship stabilization or even warming up, but compartmentalized, would be related to climate change related issues, and in particular on trying to negotiate certain types of deals with regard to climate fund, but that also very intricately related to the Inflation Reduction Act and so on and so forth, as well as the smart grid or the use of chips in a lot of this new climate or new renewable energy sector. So so climate is another area where the two countries could work together, but again, it would be another compartmentalized area. And then finally, the other area that is the two countries would see relationship warming up probably is in food security, and that's also another area where both it works for certain constituencies here in the United States, but it's also a priority for the Chinese government, in particular under Xi Jinping administration, the emphasis on food security.
Well, we're have about 10 minutes left in the event, and I know we could go on in these topics for a long time, but I want to make sure we get to some of the audience questions. I'm going to try to summarize a few questions into one question, just in the interest of efficiency. So several questions sort of around what does China have to do to get its economy back on its feet? What does it have to do to get Chinese consumers spending again, confident again? Is China open to the same kind of stimulus and consumption-oriented stimulus that we've seen in the US and other countries? Is that realistic? Is that a path that any of you could see China taking in order to restart the economy?
Should I go quickly?
Sure, go, Trent.
Okay, I'll do since I'm more of a short-term person, given that I spend a lot of days just looking at the markets. I would say two things. Very easily is a lot of this problem is self-imposed, right? So I would say that they can reverse it. And then some are harder to reverse. So one, I would say on the interest rate side, it's very hard when you have the dollar going higher to cut rates very aggressively. So one of the ways that you can reduce the high real interest rate environment that's facing, which is basically it's deflated, right? So when you have consumption deflated and supply just continue to grow, you have a challenge. And firms like inflation. So you need to be able to cut interest rates, and China at the moment cannot. So the Fed kind of just cut rates, hopefully, whenever that happens, that would put less pressure on China to be able to do that. The second one is on the demand side, whether or not China wants to do the consumption-related stimulus. President Xi Jinping doesn't really like this, right? He doesn't like making people weak by giving away things, and so on and so forth. So that's highly more challenging. I would say that you can see more likelihood of fiscal stimulus, more support from the central government side. One of the things that China can do, which people will look out for, is to take on more on the central balance sheets, right? The U.S. is very different in that post GFC, the U.S. government absorbed a lot of the toxic assets, and since the central government can borrow much cheaper than local governments and of course households, and you can actually over time delever. So I think it's more likely you have more support on the monetary side if there's room to do so, if the yuan has less pressure. Over longer term solutions for China, there are many major problems in terms of when you have an aging population, and Korea has one. So I would speak about how we can solve this, is that when you take on central government debt, it will go on. because as you have an aging society, Social Security, as you know, can only increase over time. It becomes a huge burden. And there are two ways you can fix it. You can raise taxation on the property side. You know, China talks a lot about property tax. You can raise the pension age. You know, the official age for China is very low. But these are very politically sensitive times. So I think over time it will need to have done. So taxation is a reform area where it can have more. Every EM has this problem where it can have more taxes directly, and also property tax is probably the final. Instead of getting taxed local governments from land sales, they can probably need to start thinking about taxing the property itself, and that is a form of redistribution from the extra wealthy to those that have less capital, right? So those are the areas I see on the more immediate and the longer term. And obviously, back to that geopolitical question, President Xi Jinping has been playing a lot nicer in the short term, because if you look, he came to San Francisco, he made statements. So I think the fact that China domestic issues will also cause some less escalation of tensions directly anyway, from China's side. And I think domestically too, that the loosening of regulations will become more obvious as we have the slowdown become more acute. So two prongs approach. One is putting out the fire first, and the second is to think about more structural issues, which I think will need to come down the road.
Zoe, you touched upon climate change as a potential area for cooperation, and we had a question from the audience on that. What is the impact of the slowdown on China's own climate goals? There's been talk that maybe China's emissions would peak earlier than people expected. Does that have a change in what we should expect from China in terms of contributing to fighting global warming?
In terms of cutting down CO2 emission, I think right now, China's about 60% of China's end energy consumption comes from coal, and coal also is the primary source of electricity generation in China. So if the Chinese economic slowdown continues, and if the world experience another commodity price increase due to supply side issues or disruption in the logistics, probably we'll see China, at least in the short run, revert back to be more dependent on coal-fired power plant. And on top of that, the 14th five-year plan also just have additional coal-fired power plant being scheduled to be planted. So basically, in terms of on the emission side, that is a problem. But I would say China does not only focus on, cutting down emission. The country, as the government is also investing heavily on carbon capture and sequestration. So hopefully the idea is not just focusing on cutting down consumption, but really trying to capture it, before it gets emitted into the atmosphere. Now, if we think about to what extent the economic slowdown might impact China's investment into the energy transition, I do not see, at least in the short term, China already built up a lot of excess capacity, solar panel, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the recent Central Economic Conference work, it emphasized both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side, focusing on facilitating the green transition. And on top of that, on the 7 areas of the so-called new consumption area, one of those 7 areas that the government want to promote consumption is green sector. So I'm not exactly sure how they define this green sector, but at least, that is an area where China focus on both on the supply side and on the demand side.
Well, we're almost out of time, but just to wrap it up, one of the things that is made analyzing China's economy even more difficult is the availability of data. We're seeing restrictions on negative economic coverage in China, which has reduced the ability to hear from local voices. There's statistical series that have been disappearing. I'm wondering if each of you could tell us what are the few key indicators or trends that you're really watching closely over the next 6, 12, 18 months to really get a sense of where China's economy is going? What is most important in your mind to watch? So, Trin or Gerard, Zoe, anyone who wanted to start?
Well, I mean, so you're right. They tend to redact or stop publishing or amend series that are not favorable. So I would say look at things that are either difficult to, or they cannot falsify or stop publishing. So trade data is one of them. I think Chinese trade stats are actually pretty accurate for obvious like customs reasons. The others would be probably property sector. So not the MBS data is actually kind of dodgy in terms of the price effects. There is a lot of on-the-ground reporting suggesting the price changes in certain cities are much bigger than reported. However, there are private services. So because there's so many private parties involved, it's hard to obscure that. Things like macro data is where it gets more difficult because there really aren't substitutes for that, but those are the things that people tend to dispute. So for me, it's probably, I would look at trade data and sort of third-party private sector property data.
Trin, what are you watching closely?
Inflation and trade are hard to kind of just say people always question Chinese data, but I would say you should think about China data like this. GDP is supply side driven, right? So people say, well, how can you have 5.2% GDP, but imports were declining? And why is the stock market so weak and so on and so forth? So you have to think of this is a command economy. So then GDP has less of a meaning if you're a demand oriented company. Right. So as a result, if you're a profit driven person, which basically everyone is, but so you would look at CPI, right? That's a very clear indicator what's happening, and it's very hard to CPI and trade are my two favorites. CPI is less lagging than trade, and trade another thing that's really great about trade is that China basically not just for China but for other economies, you should look at China. The release is quite timely. The only country that's more timely is actually Korea, and so when you look at it, you can look at how's Singapore doing, how's Europe doing, different cycles, right? Because it's part of a very, even if we're decoupling and we're transitioning and so on and so forth, supply chains, there's a lot there in Chinese data in terms of trade for global usage, and CPI obviously is very, very important. I think markets react quite strongly to China CPI. Zoe? And that also has implications for the rest of the world CPI as well.
I would agree with both Gerard and Trin, but I would also want to, the question that Nick you asked reminded me of the so-called Keqiang Index, where he talks of Premier Li Keqiang talking about, if I remember it correctly, railway freight volume and electricity generation volume, and the other one is bank loans, if I remember it correctly. But basically, it's an acknowledgement of exactly the question, Nick, you were pointing out, the kind of like inaccurate numbers. So in addition to what Trin and Gerard was talking about, because I really focus on consumer household consumption, two things that I would want to focus on to add on top of Trin and Gerard is the transaction volume and the value, both volume and the value on Chinese digital online shopping platforms, especially during the Double 11 days or those holidays. And then I would also wanted to look out for restaurant consumption, both in terms of consuming in the restaurant in-house versus takeout.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了，还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。 一起来3w.6度.world 尝试吧。
One of the uncertainties we all know for this interesting year 2024 is geopolitics and how it's related to both the internal political agendas of different countries and their interactions. When you are looking at our topic today, the state of Chinese economy, recharging growth, how are you looking at it from where you are, Ms. Ambassador?
I'm a China analyst. I'm not representing a government here. That's my day job. I'm here at Davos having a conversation as best I can analyse the questions that we are confronting.
Yeah.
But I've never really accepted the thesis that you see written in various parts of the world about peak China, that somehow the Chinese economy is peaking, slowing, and then heading towards something worse. And the reason I analyse it in those terms is because you don't have to have been to China hundreds of times over 40 years to conclude that the Chinese consumer is the best guarantor of China's economic future. So long as the Chinese consumer has confidence in the future, then the economy will continue to grow reasonably well. That's a core fact. And remember, the scale of the Chinese consumer market is unprecedented in global economic history.
China's economy is not headed for permanently slower growth, says former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who reckons Chinese consumers and businesses can drive faster expansion if they get their mojo back. But Mr. Rudd also warned that geopolitics could pull the floor from underneath China's growth model if the recent détente between the United States and China did not last. His comments at the World Economic Forum in Davos came after China reported 5.2% growth for 2023, an improvement on the previous year's 3% but well short of the pace it has maintained for much of the past 3 decades. A combination of lackluster exports, property market ructions and sagging infrastructure investment have kept China's economy in check, prompting some analysts to ask if the country has entered a new era of slower growth. But Mr. Rudd, who said he was speaking at Davos in a personal capacity rather than in his day job as Australia's ambassador to the US, rejected the idea that China's economy was peaking or permanently slowing. He said the untapped potential of Chinese consumer demand, which increased 7% last year, was the best guarantor of China's economic future. The Chinese consumer has had a rough time in recent years, he said, pointing to slow wages growth, youth unemployment, and many people's losses on the property and equity markets. The key question for the future is the restoration of Chinese domestic consumer confidence, because that is China's best long-term guarantee and it lies at the heart of Chinese economic policy. Mr. Rudd suggested Beijing needed to look at wages policy, tax policy, and welfare provision to help rekindle consumer confidence. The other plank of Chinese growth was its private sector, which was driving the country's innovation and job creation. But Chinese business confidence has taken a battering in recent years as well as a result of perceptions Beijing was favoring the state-owned sector over the private sector. Mr. Rudd said President Xi Jinping's administration needed to de-emphasize ideology and re-emphasize the core question of the normal profit incentives for businesses operating in a market economy, an implicit critique of Mr. Xi's trenchant avowal of Marxism-Leninism. Title 1, Fragile Truce. He also said trade could help drive growth, but a souring of U.S.-China relations could bifurcate supply chains and put a handbrake on the Chinese economy. Mr. Xi and U.S. President Joe Biden had hit the pause button on geopolitics at their meeting in San Francisco last November, but what we don't know is how long the pause button will remain pressed. Is this a tactical shift over the next 12 months, and then we will revert to where we were in previous years, where geopolitics would undermine most elements of economic confidence and trade normality? Or will this become a longer-term shift, he asked. I hope it's the latter, but that is the core question in the entree of both Joe Biden and Xi Jinping today. Speaking on the same panel, London School of Economics professor Qi Eugene said trade between the US and China was still at the heart of the global economy, even if some of it was being rerouted through Vietnam and Mexico. Responding to Mr. Rudd, she also said restraints on Chinese consumption, such as potentially slowing wages growth, youth unemployment, and losses on the property and equity markets, could keep consumption in check. But Zhu Min, a former deputy boss of the International Monetary Fund who is now vice chairman of the China Center for International Economic Exchanges, said consumption was reasonably resilient and agreed with Mr. Rudd that it would drive growth. For him, the other factors that would prop up the Chinese economy were the digitization of manufacturing and the green energy transition. But he reckoned the growth rate would stabilize at about 4%. Dr. Jean said that even if China continued to grow at 3 to 4% and India expanded 4 percentage points faster, the sheer size of the Chinese economy meant it would still contribute $130 trillion $197 trillion more to global growth by 2030 than India would. Meanwhile, JP Morgan chief executive Jamie Dimon told CNBC in Davos that it had become more difficult to gauge the risk-reward equation in China. Still, he said, they're trying to make sure that they're open for business, that they're being fair to foreign companies, a point made by Premier Li Chang the previous day.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world 尝试吧。
大家好，您现在收看的是来自六度世界的六度挑战，这是一个 AI 驱动的新型媒体，网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。网址是六度 World。节目的内容是：印度真的就要取代中国成为世界工厂了？就像是蚂蚁想要搬家，当然有可能，但这需要付出巨大的努力和付出，还需要解决诸多问题。
印度真的就要取代中国成为世界工厂了。RFA 作者阿曼婷，法国《世界报》新德里通讯员卡罗尔·迪特里希 Carol Dietrich 周四写道，印度正在吸引越来越多的智能手机商到印度生产。印度梦望取代中国成为世界工厂，但是印度的结构性弱点，比如贫困，是它和中国竞争的障碍。法国《世界报》写道，惊人的宣布是一个接着一个，不是苹果在印度生产 iPhone 15手机，就是谷歌在印度生产新款的 Pixel 8手机，或者是三星在印度生产 Galaxy S24 手机。甚至埃隆·马斯克也说他正在考虑在印度建立一家电动汽车工厂。面对这一个接一个的惊人宣布，印度人感到非常兴奋，就像印度赢得了奖杯一样。印度这个南亚巨人梦想着在全球价值链中与中国竞争。确实，近年来印度吸引的电子行业的大牌企业很多，苹果公司是越来越多跨国公司在印度身上下赌注的代表。从2017年开始，苹果公司就在印度组装低端的 iPhone 手机，然后在其台湾分包商和硕、Pegatron 和伟创 Vistronet 等的帮助下，在印度发展制造能力。从2022年开始，苹果转变了策略，开始在印度生产最新的机型，首先是 iPhone 14，然后是 iPhone 15。目前，全球销售的 iPhone 中有 12% 到 14% 是在印度制造。到2024年底前，将有1/4的苹果智能手机来自印度工厂。印度制造。印度工业和商业部长皮尤什·戈亚尔 Piyush Goyal 说，经常定调的是明星企业。印度工商部长希望苹果的例子能够向全球企业发出强烈的信号。在截至2023年3月的财政年度中，印度的智能手机出口翻了一番，达到约110亿美元。莫迪政府很久以来就希望让印度成为新的世界工厂。莫迪在2014年独立日之际的首次演讲中就宣称，我想向全世界呼吁，来印度制造吧。莫迪这位印度教民族主义者刚刚上台，就公布了他的旗舰举措，这就是印度制造计划。该计划的主要内容是增加关税，以鼓励本地生产。 2022年，印度的进口税平均为 18%， 比泰国或越南都要高。2020年，印度推出了和生产挂钩的激励措施，这是一种出口补贴，金额近220亿美元，用于智能手机、医疗产品、汽车零部件生产等14个关键行业。不过，法国《世界报》文章引述专家表示，虽然印度已经超过中国成为地球上人口最多的国家，但它仍然远远无法取代它的强大竞争对手中国。相关的专家说，印度可以取代中国的说法经常出现，但如果我们审视全球价值链的话，就会发现它与中国不在同一个环节，印度处于下游。因此，替代效应只是一种说法，而且它只是在 iPhone 类产品上。南亚巨人印度必须克服多项挑战，才能真正与中国竞争。印度的基础设施仍然不发达，电力供应也存在问题。另外，虽然印度精英工程师在世界范围内享有盛誉，但印度也同时面临和革劳动力缺乏的问题。大约有 3.5 亿印度人既不会读也不会写，只有一小部分人接受过专业教育。此外，越南、印度尼西亚、墨西哥和泰国等也都在与新德里竞争，试图吸引那些希望不再把一切都压在北京身上的外国投资者。干预主义经济政策。法国《世界报》还指出，在很大程度上，印度当局的经济政策仍然是干预主义政策。比如2023年8月，政府突然宣布限制笔记本电脑进口，以促进本地生产。该措施在该行业引起了恐慌，最终被撤回。像这样的干预主义政策也会让投资者失去热情。
啊哈，看看这篇文章，印度真是什么事都敢想，什么事都敢做呢。我看这篇文章的标题，就仿佛听到了印度呼唤：中国，你退后，我要上。自大到出奇的自信，有一种扶不起的阿斗感，你说对吧？我们先来分析一下这个情况。印度被大牌公司，比如说苹果公司、谷歌和三星盯上了，开始在印度进行生产活动。你看，这就是全球化呀。全球化不仅把商品，还有资本、技术都带到了全世界，让每个国家都有机会获得发展。也由此，我们看到了一种趋势，也就是公司开始把自己的生产线分散在全球各地，而不是集中在某个地方，比如在中国。现在，印度看到了这种全球化的趋势，就想我也来一份吧。所以，我们看到了印度工业和商业部长皮尤什·戈亚尔的想法，他希望苹果的这个例子能给全球企业发出强烈的信号，也就是希望更多的公司到印度来生产，这样印度就可以获得更多的发展机会了。但是，尽管印度这种想法不差，但是问题是，印度真的有能力成为世界的工厂吗？首先，印度的基础设施发展仍然不彻底。我们听过太多的印度停电的故事，这对于需要源源不断供电的生产线是一个巨大的问题。如果生产线因为停电而停工的话，那么生产效率会大大的降低，这对于任何公司来说都是不能接受的。其次，印度的教育问题，尤其是对于技术工人的培养问题。按照报道的数据，有 3.5 亿的印度人都不会读写，只有一小部分人接受过专业教育。那么，我的问题是，这样的教育水平怎么能够为生产线提供足够的技能熟练的劳动力呢？再者，印度的经济政策也存在问题。以限制笔记本电脑进口为例，就像小侄子突然发脾气，把别的小朋友的玩具都摔了，然后做出一副无辜的样子，投资者自然会失去热情，因为这种政策不但对自身有害，也对外国公司造成影响。最后，印度如果想要取代中国成为世界工厂，那还需要面对与地理位置相关的挑战。越南、印尼、泰国、墨西哥等都在等待，虎视眈眈，试图吸引外国投资者。印度是否有能力在这个竞争中胜出，还有待观察。综上所述，印度想要取代中国成为世界工厂，就像是蚂蚁想要搬家，当然有可能，但这需要付出巨大的努力和付出，还 还需要解决诸多问题。而对于中国来说，也不应该骄傲自满，只有不断发展，让自己的实力越来越强，才能站在世界舞台的中心。毕竟，世界工厂并不是唯我独尊的位置，只有谁更强，谁就能在这个位置站立稳健。
对于印度是否能取代中国成为世界工厂，我们可以看到印度正吸引越来越多的大牌企业到印度生产，但同时也存在着结构性弱点，比如贫困、基础设施不发达和教育问题等。所以，印度要成为世界工厂，还需要克服许多挑战。作为观众，你可能会问，印度是否有可能克服这些问题，并取代中国成为世界工厂呢？这是一个很有趣的问题。印度的确有巨大的潜力，有着庞大的人口和广阔的市场。但是，我认为印度要取代中国成为世界工厂，还需要时间和努力。印度需要改善基础设施，提升教育水平，吸引外国投资者等等。只有这样，印度才能真正成为世界工厂。同时，我们也不能忽视中国的实力和竞争优势。中国拥有庞大的工业基础、高素质的劳动力和完善的供应链，这些都是印度需要努力追赶的。所以，我认为印度有可能取代中国成为世界工厂，但这需要时间和努力。让我们拭目以待，看看印度是否能实现这一目标。那么，亲爱的观众，你有什么样的想法呢？你认为印度能取代中国成为世界工厂吗？欢迎在下方留言与我们分享你的观点和想法。谢谢大家收看六度世界。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是六度 World， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。本视频录制时间为美东时间2月23日。这期热点深度来关注王沪宁。在金门近海快递翻覆事故升温的背景下，这位中国首席思想家出来说话了。据新华社报道，2024年对台工作会议于2月22日至23日在北京召开。王沪宁出席会议时说，要坚决贯彻落实新时代党解决台湾问题的总体方略和党中央对台工作决策部署，坚定不移推进祖国统一大业。王沪宁指出，要把思想和行动统一到中共中央对台海形势分析判断和对台工作决策部署上来，进一步掌握实现祖国完全统一的战略主动，并重申要坚持一个中国原则和9·2共识，推动两岸关系和平发展，推进祖国统一进程。王沪宁强调，要扩大两岸各领域交流合作，深化两岸融合发展，要推动两岸共同弘扬中华文化，促进两岸同胞心灵契合，要坚决打击台独分裂，遏制外部势力干涉，坚定支持岛内爱国统一力量，广泛团结台湾同胞，维护台海和平稳定。对比4年前台湾大选后，中共2020年对台工作会议，当时的政治局常委、全国政协主席汪洋提到，2020年台海形势更加复杂严峻，要坚持一个中国原则，坚决反对和遏制任何形式的台独分裂活动。4年时间，措辞的变化从反对遏制台独势力变成了坚决打击台独势力。金融时报的文章引述政治分析人士说，王沪宁的措辞明显比去年该会议的声明强硬，证实了人们的预期，即在赖清德在1月13日的总统选举中获胜后，北京将加大力度促使台湾默认统一。金融时报引述台湾淡江大学教授张五岳的说法，认为上一年2023年的措辞仅限于提到和平发展，但现在他们又提到了推动统一。作为中共最高决策机构政治局常委的王沪宁的讲话是赖清德赢得选举后的首次高层政策声明。围绕着《金融时报》这篇文章的结论，王沪宁的最新发言包含更尖锐的措辞，表明在台湾大选后，中共对台湾将更加强硬，施加更大压力。围绕这篇文章产生的讨论，同意的一方认为，王沪宁的这番表态 尤其提到了坚决打击台独分裂，遏制外部势力干涉，代表着中共对台湾不仅仅将是反对台湾独立、遏制台湾，更会发展针对民进党的政策，进一步采取阻吓和制裁措施。不同意的一方则认为，推动统一这个表述已经是老生常谈，打击台独也不是新词，此前也出现过。2024重提并不会意味着军事冲突的升级，相反，2024对台工作会议的重点是维护台海和平稳定。近期，《经济学人》列克星敦专栏一篇文章，聚焦中共政治局常委、全国政协主席王沪宁。这篇文章的标题叫《中国首席思想家在美国发现的缺陷》。王沪宁于1988至1989年访问美国，并做学术交流。文章称，几十年前，作为一名年轻的来访者，王沪宁在美国看到了一股不可阻挡的危机暗流。时间回到那个年代，1988年8月，作为一名年轻中国政治学家，王沪宁来到美国进行为期6个月的访问。他欣赏了密苏里州圣路易斯市的盖特威拱门，分析了马萨诸塞州贝尔蒙特镇政府的情况，观看了马里兰州安纳波利斯海军学院的一场橄榄球赛，参观了爱荷华州爱荷华市的一家洗涤剂工厂。他对街头乞讨者之多感到震惊，对家具店水床之柔软感到惊讶。有一个问题一直困扰着他，这样一个年轻的国家怎么会比他拥有2000多年历史的祖国跑得如此之快？他在美国的活力中发现了许多值得尊敬的地方，但也发现了可能将其撕裂的矛盾。中国观察家们对王沪宁的美国之行在多大程度上影响了中国的现代化进程争论不休。众所周知的是，仅几年后，他就离开了学术界，中断了他的大量出版工作，帮助连续3任国家主席江泽民、胡锦涛、习近平确定共产党的思想和政策。现在，他是习近平的意识形态和宣传部长，是共产党执政机构政治局的7名常委之一。美国人也应该从他身上学习，时至今日，他们仍然可以。在冷战结束，互联网将虚拟世界打入现实世界之前，王沪宁的著作《美国反对美国》是一个时间胶囊。那时的中国访客可能会惊叹美国人可以用电动工具削铅笔，通过电话订购披萨。王沪宁则在书中提醒美国读者，在那个年代，美国人也对从种族主义到游民问题等大问题感到焦虑。对王沪宁来说，美国是一片陌生的土地，但同时，王沪宁也发现了那些犹如墙纸一样容易被美国人忽略却又无处不在的细节。王沪宁发现，在美国到处都有微妙的控制，警察不必强制发放身份证，因为政府说服每个公民自愿拥有身份证，将其称为驾照，并通过机动车代理机构发放。可口可乐等大公司使政府不再需要管理数百万人的生活。由于几乎所有东西都可以用美元计价，因此自愿追求资金来源，而不是任何意识形态或政治胁迫制度，才是稳定的最终来源。王沪宁写道，人们管理着金钱，同时又用金钱管理着人们。技术优势已成为美国人民族优越感的来源。如果你想压倒美国人，你必须做一件事，在科学和技术方面超过他们。王沪宁对美国的公共图书馆感到惊讶，他认为中国古代思想是独一无二的，但由于缺乏分享的途径而未能影响世界。相比之下，美国的图书馆让每个人都能获得世代相传的知识。他写道，修建水库的目的不是为了蓄水，而是为了灌溉。知识是社会进步的源泉，但也是社会冲突的根源。如何在没有后者的情况下获得前者？在参观普利茅斯种植园和自由中后，王沪宁对美国人如何利用其薄弱的历史灌输共同的政治传统表示钦佩。鉴于最近发生的事件，他在书中最感人的一段是描述了老布什总统的就职典礼。老布什总统的就职典礼给王沪宁留下了深刻印象。他写道，重要的结果不是新总统拥有了权力，而是老总统因此失去了权力。但王沪宁并不认为美国的统一力量和传统能够抵御其离心力。他被称为中国的托克维尔。托克维尔是法国思想家，在托克维尔著作《论美国的民主》一书里，托克维尔以自己游历美国的经验，从古典自由主义的思想传统出发，探索美国的民主制度及其根源。这本书成为早期社会学的重要著作之一。 但王沪宁对托克维尔的一个重要结论不屑一顾。王沪宁写道：有像托克维尔这样来自一个更加不平等社会的人，才能看到美国，并感受到一个实现条件平等的国家。美国人可能声称既重视自由又重视平等，但这些价值观不可避免地会发生冲突。美国人把自由放在首位，他们不愿意缴纳可能带来更大平等的税款，结果造成了贫富分化的不稳定。美国人还声称把家庭作为社会的基本单位，但在精神上，家庭正在被掏空，因为美国人实际上强调的是个人。让王沪宁感到不安的是，父母将1岁以下的孩子分房税，并鼓励他们的孩子从18岁开始离开家，像上战场一样进入社会。这些孩子没有时间照顾年迈的父母，但由于对税收的抵制，政府也无法照顾他们或其他留守儿童。王沪宁对艾伦·布鲁姆1987年出版的《美国心灵的封闭》一书很感兴趣。该书对高等教育转向文化相对主义表示遗憾。文化相对主义是认为不同的文化具有不同的伦理实践主张。王沪宁认为，对共同价值观的抛弃正在引发美国的精神危机。他认为，美国的制度以个人主义、享乐主义和民主为基础，正在输给日本的制度以集体主义、忘我和专制为基础。经济学人的这篇文章认为，王沪宁错了。中国模式如今看起来也不那么热门，但许多美国人已经开始认同王沪宁的结论，即美国的矛盾正在形成一股不可阻挡的危机暗流。盖洛普公司最近的一项民意调查显示，对美国的民主运作方式表示满意的美国人仅占 28%， 创下历史新低。理智的美国人仍然认为，只要川普的支持者能够清醒地认识到他对美国体制的威胁，他们就会拒绝他。令人不寒而栗的现实是，这正是他们喜欢他的地方。王沪宁可能没有预料到川普，但他确实发现了公民美德的腐蚀，正是这种腐蚀让这位曾经的，也可能是未来的总统把许多东西撕得粉碎。好了，以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注6度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的辛枫视线。这两天，英伟达可以说是科技界的最大明星。本周三公布了增长惊人的业绩之后，引起了华尔街的狂欢。有网友做了这张图，戏称英伟达是托起了全球经济。还有网友称，英伟达就是男人的 Taylor Swift。而作为一家上市公司，英伟达花了24年的时间，将其估值达到1万亿美元。而第二个1万亿美元，英伟达只花了8个月的时间。本周五早盘，英伟达市值突破2万亿美元，仅落后于微软和苹果，成为了美国市值第3大的公司。英伟达的图形处理芯片每颗价值数万美元，已经成为硅谷的稀缺珍品。而英伟达在这一领域拥有超过 80% 的市场份额。由于英伟达的芯片价值高昂而且稀有，以至于在交付的时候，一家企业披露是用装甲车来装的。全行业旺盛的需求已经远超英伟达的生产速度。本周三，英伟达公布连续第3个季度业绩超出预期，供应仍然十分紧张。预计今年推出的新一代人工智能芯片将会受到供应能力的限制。英伟达首席执行官兼创始人黄仁勋表示，生成式人工智能正在掀起一波价值数万亿美元的投资浪潮。他相信这将使全球数据中心的数量在未来5年内增加1倍，并且为人工智能带来新的市场机遇。黄仁勋称，一个全新的行业正在形成，这是推动英伟达增长的动力。英伟达周三公布的去年第4季度销售额为221亿美元，是前一年同期的3倍多，并且超出了华尔街最乐观的预期。这一结果使得英伟达股价在周四上涨至历史最高收盘价785.38美元。周五上午，英伟达的市值更是一度突破2万亿美元，股价今年迄今已经上涨 59%。英伟达成立于30多年前，最初专注于电脑游戏的计算机图形芯片， 但是很早就锁定了人工智能领域，而其创始人黄仁勋始终担任公司的 CEO， 是科技行业任期最长的首席执行官之一。他目前拥有8660万股英伟达股票，价值约680亿美元。2006年，黄仁勋决定把他的图形芯片开放用于计算机图形以外的用途，这为英伟达的人工智能崛起奠定了基础。工程师很快就开始将它们用于人工智能计算，而事实证明这一尝试尤为成功，因为构建复杂人工智能系统正是需要数学与图形芯片来相结合，而不是用传统的中央处理器的工作方式。创建最复杂的人工智能系统通常需要上万个英伟达最先进的芯片，而分析师估计每个芯片售价约为25000美元。据估计，英伟达每年可以生产约120万个芯片，满足全球的需求已经变得十分困难。需求的激增导致英伟达的竞争对手开始开发自己的人工智能芯片。AMD 公司已经开始销售与英伟达竞争的芯片，预计今年这些芯片的销售额将会超过35亿美元。而英特尔也已经开始销售可以处理人工智能计算的中央处理器。还有大量的制造人工智能芯片的初创公司，谷歌和亚马逊等大型云计算公司则正在加强内部人工智能芯片的开发。微软于11月份推出了首款 AI 芯片，名为 Maya 100。与此同时，初创公司和大型科技公司都在宣传他们已经积累了多少英伟达芯片，手头有多少。上个月，脸书创始人扎克伯格就表示，他的公司计划在今年年底前拥有35万个英伟达 H100 芯片，而按照当前的芯片价格来计算，这至少需要花费几十亿美元。甚至一些大学也以拥有 H100 芯片为荣，以此来吸引招生。像是普林斯顿大学去年在网站上发布的消息中就表示，该大学计划筹备有300个英伟达 H100 芯片的最先进的计算基础设施。微软则已经制定了一个专门配给计划，由高管来决定如何在微软内部的项目之间分配剩余的英伟达资源。许多分析师和行业高管都表示，英伟达的优势不会轻易被竞争所削弱，因为英伟达多年以来的累积使其芯片拥有深度和复杂性。英伟达最近的增长速度完全超过了它的同行，但是一些业内人士也表示， AMD 和英特尔在开发与人工智能芯片相匹配的系统方面也已经取得了重大进展，1年之后，半导体短缺的情况可能会有所好转。而在这么多竞争对手当中，英伟达在周三晚间向美国证券交易委员会提交的最新文件当中，首次将华为列为人工智能芯片等多个类别的顶级竞争对手。英伟达表示，中国的华为在供应图形处理器、中央处理器和网络芯片等人工智能芯片方面存在竞争力。英伟达还将华为定位为一家自主设计硬件和软件，并且能够改进人工智能计算的云服务公司。华为最近开发了升腾系列芯片，作为英伟达 AI 芯片系列的竞争对手。华为的 910B 芯片对标英伟达的 A100 芯片。分析师估计，中国人工智能芯片市场价值约70亿美元。去年，路透社报道，中国的搜索巨头百度就向华为下了大量芯片的订单。英伟达指出，它的其他竞争对手还包括英特尔、AMD、博通和高通等芯片公司，以及亚马逊和微软等几家大型云计算公司。英伟达公布惊人的业绩，获得地球上最重要的股票殊荣之后，全球股市从日本到欧洲纷纷创出新高。全球投资人对人工智能股票的追捧也热炒了其他的周边板块，不仅是提振了各国的科技股，还拉高了整个市场轨迹。不过遗憾的是，中国是唯一一个错失这轮良机的主要市场。盛宝银行的股票策略主管表示，这一结果将会带旺未来几周的股市人气，广义的美国科技的行情也可能会扩大。今年前2个月，全球股市已经上涨近5%，并且在本周4创出新高，与人工智能相关的股票在其中做出了重要贡献。在周5暴涨之前，英伟达今年在 MSCI 世界指数中已经贡献了1/5，脸书的母公司 Meta 则贡献第2大，微软则是第3大功臣。而在亚洲方面，自2023年年初以来，日本股市也是节节攀升，涨幅甚至超过了标普500指数，而其中涨幅前5强的股票就有3只来自于芯片公司。随着科技股受到热捧，本周4日本股市再次超越了历史高位， 科技股领涨。台湾的基准股指上周也在台积电的推动下大涨至历史高位。科技股行情推动纳斯达克100指数的估值升至历史最高水平，但是随着估值不断的上升，过高的估值最终可能会抑制进一步的上涨。而全球股市中只有一个大玩家错过了人工智能这一波大行情，那就是中国。中国股票在经济疲软和房地产阴影中喋喋不休。自2023年年初以来，恒生科技指数下跌了17%，而同期的纳斯达克100指数则飙升了60%。中国股市本周稍微有了一些好转的迹象。农历新年之后，沪指连续8天上涨，在周五终于收复3000点大关。周五收盘，沪指涨0.55%，报3004.88点。统计数据显示，沪深两市以及北交所共有4397只股票上涨，822只股票下跌，而这背后主要还是依靠政府干预在起作用。最近几周，决策层宣布了一系列支撑市场的措施，包括禁止开盘和收盘时净卖出，整顿量化基金交易，并且出动国家队买入股票和 ETF， 进行了所谓的积极干预。但是股民真正的信心是否有所回升？这样的干预还能持续多久？这都是一个未知数。以上就是今天新风事件的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
6度旅行管家，你的旅行全策划。注册或登录6度世界，点击右上角机器人按钮，然后选择6度旅行管家，就可以开始与 AI 对话了。
你好，很高兴能为你服务。你打算去哪里旅行呢？
我想去希腊。
太棒了，希腊是一个美丽的国家。你对希腊的哪些方面感兴趣呢？比如历史遗迹、美食、海滩或者其他的？
海滩和美食。
好的，了解了。你有没有任何饮食禁忌或者特殊的饮食要求，比如素食、无麸质食品等？
不吃牛肉。
好的，我会注意在推荐餐厅时避免牛肉。你计划的旅行时间是多久呢
？4天。
了解了。你是打算独自旅行，还是和他人一起？这会影响到旅行的安排。
与父母一起。
好的，我会考虑到这一点。你的预算大概是多少呢？这会影响到住宿和餐饮的选择。
1000欧一天。
好的，这是一个相当宽裕的预算。你对住宿有什么特别的要求吗？比如希望住在市中心，或者希望有海景，或者需要特别的设施？
希望有海景。
根据你的需求，我为你找到了一些在希腊的海景酒店。这些酒店都有很好的海景，你可以根据你的喜好和预算来选择。接下来，我将为你规划一个4天的旅行行程。你希望在这4天里每天都去海滩吗？还是希望有1天或2天去参观一些历史遗迹或者市区
？1天海滩，2天历史遗迹，1天市区。
根据你的要求和我从网络上找到的信息，我为你制定了以下的旅行计划。第1天，海滩。你可以选择去希腊最美的海滩之一，比如 Elefonici 海滩或 Navigo 海滩。这些海滩都有清澈的海水和美丽的景色。在那里，你可以尽情享受阳光和海滩，或者参加一些水上活动。第2天和第3天，历史遗迹。第2天，你可以参观希腊最著名的历史遗迹之一雅典卫城。在那里，你可以看到帕台农神庙和其他古代建筑。第3天，你可以选择去德尔菲，这是一个古代的宗教中心，也是世界遗产之一。或者你也可以去克诺索斯宫，这是欧洲最古老的城市之一。第4天，市区。在雅典市区，你可以参观一些有趣的地方，比如古老的波卡区、现代的购物中心，或者一些美术馆和博物馆。你也可以在当地的餐厅品尝希腊美食，比如希腊沙拉、烤羊肉和橄榄油面包。住宿推荐。根据你的预算和要求，我为你找到了一些海景酒店的推荐。这些酒店都有优美的海景，同时也提供高质量的服务。餐饮推荐。在希腊，你可以尝试一些当地的美食，比如希腊沙拉、烤羊肉和橄榄油面包。但是请注意，由于你不吃牛肉，所以在点餐时需要提醒服务员。希望这个旅行计划能满足你的需求。如果你有任何问题或需要更多的信息，欢迎随时向我提问。